What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training HQ. Eddie Hall's deadlift advice is retarded. And what I mean by that is it will lead to a slower than usual pull from the floor. So to get into what I'm talking about a video where Eddie Hall gives advice to Nathaniel Messiah. And instead of reframing everything, I'll just play the full clip right now.
Drive my legs. What do you think?
If you paid me to deadlift coach you, I would say that was shit. You want the fucking truth?
What was bad about it?
I think the bar is too much over your toes. Your grip is too narrow. Like you say, I think because your stance is so narrow, your grip is too narrow. And you're right in what you say is the wider you have it, the shorter you're making
from
that
your
distance.
Legs. From your legs.
Yes.
Like if wherever your legs are, your hands should be right by them, not much further wider.
I agree.
Yeah.
100% agree. But if your stance is too narrow, then your hands are too narrow. And you're actually restricting yourself in from the knees upwards, because if your hands are too narrow, all this meaty flesh, your lats and everything is going to stop you getting that lockout power. Whereas you just a little bit wider, it gets rid of all that restriction.
So upon seeing this clip, I commented that untested lifters always give the worst advice. Now, unsurprisingly, that was a controversial comment. That's ultimately the inspiration for this video, is I got a plethora of responses. Surely everyone's rational on Instagram. And before I go further, I'll say not all untested lifters are bad people. Some, I assume, are decent people.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
So, first of all, Nathaniel Messiah's deadlift is excellent. He's one of the strongest natural deadlifters in the world. He's an IPF lifter, and also his deadlift style, I will say there's one point that was true about what Eddie Hall said, is the fact that he is pretty far away from the bar. So you could say that, all right, maybe being slightly closer to the bar and having a slightly less positive shin angle would actually be effective. I do think that's pretty reasonable advice. It really depends, though, because it depends on the personal style of how you get into the lift, because inevitably the bar will roll back into you. So it's actually better on a conventional deadlift to be slightly too far away and have the bar roll back into you, as opposed to it slightly too close, because then once it pushes out by pushing out from your shins, kicking it out, that's actually much harder to recover from because it doesn't correct itself as immediately. So that's why often you'll see on conventional, you could start slightly too far away, but on sumo, it tends to be the opposite, where if it's at all too far away, you kind of can't recover from that in time. So there is that nuance to it, but that part's a fair point. The part that is just ridiculous is the idea that he has to grip wider, in that because he already has a wide stance, so then just go wider overall. And this connects to, obviously, how Eddie Hall himself deadlifts. He is just a gigantic man, and he is a strongman competitor. And that is, undeniably, that is obviously an effective way for him to pull, as he's pulled 500 kilograms and is one of the greatest strength athletes of all time. However, this connects to a broader issue, and that is, yes, it's both extreme talent, but also I do think it's unique to the untested steroid-using side of things, is that there's this unique ignorance, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we saw this with Robert Oberst when he talked about how deadlifts are really never worth doing across the board. And he gave his argument that for football players, they might as well just do power cleans, which isn't a crazy thing to say, but overall the strength in which he said it, and then he uses himself as an example that he always got injured while doing conventional deadlifts. It was just a classic case of, you see this over and over again, is these extremely strong steroid-using lifters not almost always, but if anyone's going to have an overly dogmatic opinion, it tends to be them. So let's talk about why. So in my opinion, the first reason is obviously the risk-taking behavior associated with using illegal drugs. Like sometimes it's so normalized on YouTube that we forget to say, that is weird. It is weird to use drugs for a sport. That is not a common thing of people A lot of this drama that tends to come around, and it is just because ultimately you are juicing yourself up, both in terms of the desire to do that, but then also the effects that those hormones are going to have literally on your brain. And we know that drugs lower IQ. So the second point that I would say, though, and this is probably the more profound one, is that when you are elite at something, you simply don't have to develop other skills. There's actually no reason to do so. And I have a unique perspective on this because I've experienced both sides of this. myself, not the side of using, but I myself coming onto YouTube, I was the strongest YouTuber that I really knew of. And I was one of the strongest in the world in my age and weight class, up to second at Worlds in 2015. And I experienced that feeling of like, oh, I could just post a 10 rep max squat set and then get, 180,000 views. It was like, literally, I don't even have to say anything. And when you experience that, like, I literally remember my mindset back then was very just like, I didn't care about some information that people would expect me to care about. Now, obviously, I was never, overly brash or anything like that. But I remember when the Hodge twins and Ian McCarthy way back in the day had their dispute, I was totally on the Hodge twin side. Like, I was always siding with the bros, and fundamentally I still would, because I still do think training hard, and I love the Hodge twins to this day, actually. I actually like them even more now, if you know what I'm saying. But those who know will know. But the thing that I've always resonated with is obviously just training hard first, and then having good arguments comes way later. But then as you mature, you start to see that, yeah, that still is true. That's always fundamentally true. But you start to mellow out and realize like, oh, there are people who are so strong who know nothing, who really are just not even interested in it. Like, for example, not saying this person knows nothing, but I know Nick Yu, he's like a 17-year-old who deadlifted 880 pounds. And I believe when he did that, he said he wasn't even on a program. And he's not coached or anything. He squats well over 6, is just obscenely jacked, especially for his age. And we see more and more of that come up. And then you realize like those bro science arguments truly are wrong to a level to where you just, if you relied on that, you would just be out of the industry immediately. So the main point is that with myself, I literally experienced, I had to gain knowledge and become a more serious kind of, I wouldn't say debater, but almost a marketer of ideas of strength training, where you're like, okay, here's why you should do the plat squat. Here's why you should do this. I always equated it to almost like a sales pitch. Because fundamentally, like, that's kind of the only thing you can and should do beyond a certain point. Because you can't just say like, oh, this worked for me, therefore whatever. Like when Eddie Hall gives that advice, how many people is he thinking of when he gave that advice? One. Just himself. He's just thinking, yeah, when I gripped wider, it worked better. He's not thinking like, well, yeah, for 100 kilogram lifters, I tend to see this tendency, and I've kept up to date on IPF lifters here, and I noticed on a stiff bar. It's like, it's not even a thought that enters the brain. But the main point is it's not a thought that enters the brain, not because he's an idiot. It's because there's literally no financial incentive for him to ever have that thought. If you're making like $500,000 or $1 million, $3 million, $4 million a year, whatever the case is, I'm no pocket watch or anything. It just wouldn't be worth it to even learn that. And that's actually a funny thing to think about, is that it really is our fault for even asking him. But then the third point, and obviously this is the crux of the mechanistic argument, is that when you introduce drugs, you're introducing such a meaningful exogenous variable that you're not going to get the same feedback from your own experience even on what's effective for strength training. And this is kind of the point that I'll end it on, is I actually do think it's pretty interesting that you don't see bodybuilding even be as bad as some of the strength training when it comes to this, because I think strength training actually is worse. You really almost never see someone like a Mike Israetel on the side of strength training who uses steroids. So for example, data-driven strength. There's no equivalent on the untested side to data-driven strength. And I will say that even Jeff Nippard, I do see as a level above any other bodybuilding resource. So I'd say Jeff Nippard and data-driven strength, when it comes to bodybuilding and powerlifting, you see a level of care and meticulous, research into topics to where Jeff takes a full month to make one video. I don't think you see that ever on any untested lifter in the world. Like literally, I don't think there's one untested lifter, one steroid user who spends a month to make one video, just ever. Because I don't even think they'd have the patience. But especially, again, it comes back to incentives. It's just like, that's not even the lane they're trying to be in. And I do think that's a very interesting thing to think about, because I know with the Canadian strongman Mitchell, even with his YouTube videos, it's like very fast. It's like crank one. And again, I'm not speaking on his controversy. I know he has some personal drama right now. But it's one of those where you see a level of thoughtfulness on the drug tested side that you just don't see on the untested side. It was funny to me. There was one clip where Chris Bumstead was talking about science-based training, and he was referring to science-based training kind of being overthinking. And then he was talking about like cycling rep ranges and all that.
If you're so focused on getting absolute deep stretch with a 4-second negative, proper, perfect execution, all these things 100%, or mentally, that's fatiguing. And to do that for, let's say, optimized periodization, you're going to do a 4-week program of 18 to 20 reps, and then you're going to bring it down to 6 to 10 once your volume's high and you're building your strength with X, Y, and Z. If you can't get there mentally, because mentally you're too fatigued to go to failure on that set, and you're like thinking too much, like you just stop, versus just like turning your brain off and just going full tilt to failure, you're not getting as much benefit. But are you failing because your muscles are failing, or because mentally you can't keep thinking about the fucking 4-second negative for long enough, you know?
You can try and be as optimal as possible, but there's a time for just sort of pure aggression.
Yeah.
Where it's like, that's not even, nobody who's science-based is claiming that for bodybuilding. Like, it's actually the exact opposite. Is like, if anything, right now, this kind of quote-unquote science-based argument is more 4 to 8 reps, RP9 on everything. You know, that's what you see on TikTok. I would say the more well-balanced argument is just a more broad, 5 to 15 reps. RP probably 8 to 10 is all acceptable. But it is just funny to say that, like, they're so disconnected from the world that their view of what a science-based lifter is just like doesn't even make any type of sense. It's just like this made up thing that's not even based off of any one person, to where he probably just hasn't even seen, an argument by someone who we would consider to be science-based, or just seen a study. Just like any study. I've never seen a study really talk about cycling reps being even remotely considered a necessity. And it is just one of those funny things where I think that it is a great example that the bro science argument is not just against the science. It just has no need to even know of any of it. Also, this might be a controversial thing to say, but I think if Eddie Hall never used steroids, and obviously this is a hypothetical, I think if he competed against Nathaniel Messiah, he would deadlift less. I do think natural lifters have more rare strength by the percentage of population of the general public because there's simply way more of them. And we've seen that refinement over time to where oftentimes they can pull straight up more than untested lifters. But especially in a situation like this where Nathaniel Messiah, I mean, if he hopped on drugs and just got as big as humanly possible, I do think a lot of people like that could honestly set all-time world records that we will just never see. And that's something where a lot of normies will just not agree with that. A lot of people here probably won't agree with that. And I'll also add that I do think of untested lifters, slightly less elite untested lifters would be more likely to give good advice, because then they're not relying as much just on that reputation. But I do think that's kind of becoming a new phenomenon where there are some thoughtful untested lifters.
I trained and competed for 15 years before going on. I was already a national level competitor. I was pretty strong. I had shown myself what I could do, and I objectively looked at a higher height that I could potentially go to, weighed out the cost versus the benefit, and made a conscious decision.
But it's a rarer slice for sure, because to decide to use drugs, you typically have to have a really strong reason to do so. So if you're going to be, maybe one of the greatest of all time, then sure. So if you are in that camp, though, then I think those lifters can end up being pretty thoughtful if they're not world record holders, but they're just kind of in that really good range, and they still have to figure a lot of things out to continue to progress. But for the most part, in my opinion, the best sources of advice are people who stayed natural for a very long time and are at that very good to great lifter range, but not at that absolute elite world record range, because that's the range where you both have seen real results and overcome challenges, because you do actually need tangible results for what you're saying to make sense, because it should work, right? But at the same time, you had to do that. There was a necessity, and that necessity is so important, where if you didn't have to figure out anything to bench 400 pounds versus if you actually had to add that extra bench day, you actually had to shift the priority of the primary day in order to squat 600 pounds. Now you're going to know a lot of information to get someone to even squat 405 who may be stuck at 380. There are people like that who exist. Not everyone has the same potential, right? Whereas someone who squatted 700 pounds just off one bulk and is kind of still shooting up, it's like, yeah, they're just not going to even have to entertain the same battles. So at best, they're going to figure it out with you and just be like, all right, well, let's just try a bunch of things because I've never experienced this. Yeah, that's the overall point. And again, I don't want this video to be negative or anything. It's just you have to look for who is going to even care in the first place to learn your situation and to adapt to a variety of situations. And fundamentally, it comes down to experience actually coaching people, or experience with programs for a multitude of people of different body types, different body weights, different experience levels, and fundamentally different recovery. And unless you have that, you're just going to have someone who just assumes like, well, you could probably tolerate squatting one time a week because that's all I can tolerate, which tends to be the case as you get bigger and bigger and have more muscle mass. So that's it, guys. If you do want your form checked by someone who would adjust to your personal situation, then link is in the description to the Candido Forever program. I do form checks every 2 weeks, Q&As every other week. So every week there's always something. And there's actually going to be a new program fairly soon on the 5-rep max phase. So that being said, guys, make sure to like the video and comment below if you agree with me. Do you agree with me that untested lifters don't know what they're talking about? Peace.